This video is made for the audience who need advices or who are planning to study abroad or who wants to know about the Western classical music and how it is different from Indian classical music. So this is the new series I have started wherein I'll be inviting the selective artists and they'll be talking about their experiences and about their instruments, and we'll be talking about the journey from the start to where they are now and their different point of views and perspective in their areas. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, then stay tuned till the end of the video, or else you can skip the video and watch something else. So in today's podcast, I have Sandeep, who started his journey with the engineering and then later started his career in music. If you are new here to my channel and would like to watch this podcast and more videos like this, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Let's come to the interesting part of the video now. Hi Sandeep, I hope you're doing absolutely well. I would like to start this conversation by asking you to tell us about yourself. What do you do as an opera singer?
Hi Vivek, it's great to talk to you. I am predominantly an opera singer and I pretty much work around the world, and what I do is I work as a freelance musician, so I work with various opera companies and opera houses. I am also a composer. I've written a few operas, musicals, and I also spend a lot of my time being a collaborative artist, where I work with dancers and poets and artists across the spectrum, doing all kinds of interesting and wacky, crazy ideas and put on performance pieces. Besides also, academic research and things like that, which I'm interested in.
Thank you so much for answering my question. Now I would like to ask you, what inspires you, what motivates you to be at where you are now?
So what motivates me? That's an interesting question. It's because when I think of motivation and inspiration and things like that, I feel like you can come at it from multiple different angles. You can come at it from the external angle of sustenance, of where you have to kind of make money to kind of earn a livelihood and a living and things like that, which are all genuine needs and necessities of any person. But then there's also the intrinsic motivations, which kind of are the overarching goals that you might have, or the things you might consider to be doing in a few years, or just kind of more philosophical goals that might kind of put you on a path that you think would lead you to a place where you would like to be. And I think it's a privilege that us as kind of artists and musicians, and the way that we kind of convey ourselves to an audience is through the emotions and emoting a story or a musical or whatever it is. And I think that's a privilege to be able to kind of be dealing in that currency. Then there's also the economic goals. There's all kinds of goals which kind of motivate me and put me on a path of saying, and it also depends on the circumstances, I guess, which might be the most predominant forces at that point in time. So when you operate from either scarcity or abundance, it depends. Those kind of become the grips that kind of motivate you in one way or the other. And so inspiration is born through all of these kinds of things. And where I am right now is kind of in that spot where I have goals and I have aspirations, but at the same time I have the circumstances that I find myself in. So I'm sorry if that sounds really philosophical and winded, but I guess that's kind of where I come from at the moment.
You are actually right about the whole process which goes behind the scene of where you are now. Why Western classical music? And specifically speaking, why opera in particular?
Why Western classical? Why opera? Again, I guess there's a really simple answer to that. I kind of stumbled into it. There wasn't any pre-planned or predetermined outlook towards what I wanted to do in terms of that. I mean, I was doing engineering in a prominent college in India, and I didn't want to do that anymore, which seems kind of cliche, but I guess that's kind of what it was. And I happened to find KM Music Conservatory, and from there, just things kind of set in motion this passion that I didn't even know I had, which was to understand the depth and knowledge that was being taught to me, and to kind of see that to a meaningful end. And I'm still on that journey at the moment. So I guess there's not a really heroic answer of why Western classical music and opera, but I can tell you what I like about it and why it keeps drawing me to it. So I discovered that there's always a very superficial way of kind of looking at any sort of art form, where you take a look at what it kind of sounds like or looks like at first glance. And that to me never felt like something that I could truly get on board with. So I somehow always developed this idea of how do I delve deeper into every artistic avenue that exists, because I always find it to be both intellectually an intellectual challenge, but also more um, fulfilling idea of how do I understand what the intent of the artist and the composer and the theory of things behind them are. And so that is something that always raised my curiosity. And I was able to go down that path, whether it was vocal training for a very, very long time, or whether it was learning the theoretical things of, whatever it is, harmony, melody, composition, and things like that. That really just drew me. And the more I got involved in it, the more I started liking it. And I guess that's kind of what it is in any field. The more you kind of do the things in it, aren't engrossed in projects which really, thrill you and excite you, that puts you on a path which makes you want to enjoy it more and more. So yeah, I mean, sorry for, again, another long answer, but it's something that kind of just set in motion through the circumstances that I was in. And now that I'm there, I would love to, share that kind of knowledge and that kind of beauty that exists in this art form to whoever will listen, whoever will come on board. And even if I can kind of trick them into listening to it, I'm totally on board with that.
Thank you so much for sharing how important it is to you, not only as an education, but this defines you as a person. I feel your personality comes within the music. Do you have any favorite composer? If yes, then why is it so? What sparks you about that composer?
Do I have any favorite composer? I guess I gravitate in Western classical, European classical music specifically. I guess I gravitate more towards art songs. It's just because there's a really intimate dialogue between me and usually a pianist, where we get to, and art songs are just generally, especially if they're, if it's in a traditional setting, it's usually just with a pianist and a singer. Of course, there could be other instruments as well, but it's it's an art form which I find very, very unique in the sense that I'm able to develop some sort of relationship with another musician, just one on one, where we are trying to tell a story that is both a journey through the musical notes, but also a journey through the story, and we're trying to bring the audience along with it. And that really, that's something that I really enjoy a lot. So, art song composers, I guess there's so many. I mean, just to name like a few, I love a lot of English composers, early 20th century English composers like Butterworth, Gurney, and there's obviously Ralph Vaughan Williams. Then there's also composers which are on the French side of things, so like Ravel, Debussy, then Italian Tosti. So art songs are really, really interesting. I mean, of course, there's Schubert and Schumann and the classics as well. In terms of opera, composers that I really, really enjoy, I mean, I've recently, well, at least for the last 2 or 3 years, been involved with a lot of contemporary opera. And that's something that really excites me. So I like opera that's really out there and very wacky and has a lot of extended techniques and things where you're kind of like whistling and shouting and crawling on the floor and doing all kinds of weird but crazy things. And that is something that I've been involved with quite a few projects that have done that, and I find that to be really interesting. But of course, I mean, if you go back to the traditional ones, I love late romantic opera. So there's obviously like the Wagner and Verdi and Mozart, and I also love the more comic operas of Mozart, which are fantastic. And those are the kind of things that I always kind of take on.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Sandeep. Do you sing Indian classical or Carnatic music? Then how would you define both Western and Indian or Carnatic music? What are your views on that? And please briefly discuss this point, maybe pointing out generic information along with a bit of a history in it.
So this is definitely an interesting question. So I do sing a little bit of both Hindustani and Carnatic classical music. I have had a little bit of training in both. One of the things that I always find interesting whenever people talk about like, oh, can you tell me what the differences are and which do you like more or what does it mean, blah, blah, blah. I always hear the answer where a lot of people kind of simplify it down to, oh yes, of course, Western classical music has harmony and it's kind of built in that direction, and Indian classical music is all about the melody and that's it. I mean, well, of course, if you, on a very generic scale, that is generally, you could say that's true. So the way that I like to look at it is Indian classical music, whether Carnatic or Hindustani, I mean, they're within those two itself, there's a lot of similarities and a massive amount of difference as well. But if I just take them as like a monolith just for a second, and European classical music as like a monolith just for a second, you have to think that Indian classical music does have a lot of harmony in it. I mean, the whole idea of Shruti box or Tanpura is so that you are firmly established in a certain home note, which is Sa. And that firm establishment of a home gives you, or it provides the ability for you to kind of clash with that drone to provide the colors of harmony. That's kind of what harmony is, isn't it? It's the idea of providing colors to a melody or a note in order for you to kind of perceive it in different light. And of course, Indian classical music does that all the time. I don't say I disagree with the idea that Indian classical music is heavily based on melody versus Western classical music is based on the idea of harmony. I'd say that it's more nuanced than that, and Indian classical music does have a lot of harmony in it. Especially when you have two or three musicians playing together and they're all improvising at the same time. What do you think is happening? They're creating harmony at that point in time. And of course, it might not be as intentional as like written down music, but it is happening, and that the effect is what's important, or the affect on the audience is what's important. And also, it's another thing about timelines as well. So Western classical music has the idea of there being a progression of like one era after another era after another. Of course, this is all in retrospect because that's how kind of historians looked at it, saying, okay, well, this era had this type of harmony, so and then the next era had another type of harmony, and so on and so forth. So they kind of classified the progression of Western classical music into like massive eras, which said that this 100 years had this particular style, which again is a massive simplification because changes happened gradually and there was a lot of overlap as well. But in Indian classical music, of course, there was the idea of preserving a tradition which is again thousands of years old in the way that it is. Innovation happened in very, very different ways within these two. I mean, so if you think about it, when was the really, really famous Carnatic musician Annamaya? He existed at the same time as Palestrina, the first composer to kind of codify counterpoint and the idea of one note against the other note and really write that down. And that was happening almost simultaneously. I think that they overlapped by about 20 years with Annamaya, whose kirtanas people still sing today. And if you kind of go further down the line, you can see that Tyagaraja was at the same time, or if not overlapped with Beethoven. Or if you want to, draw these parallels, you can kind of see that, of course, you can look at them as isolated things which happened, obviously separate thousands and thousands of miles away. But for the most part, innovation was happening in both of them, where people were trying to find new ways to effectively deliver a story. And in Indian classical music, that happened through the idea of how can we manipulate notes in a particular scale to evoke a certain emotion and do that more and more intricately. And the same thing about manipulating notes happened in Western classical music as well, where people started saying, okay, can we create an atmosphere through a dense cluster of notes in certain combinations? That's kind of what every music does, right? They want to stretch out your idea of being suspended in this feeling until the point comes where you have to return back home in order to satisfy whatever this melody or harmony is. And that stretch, that idea of having to go through this journey is common between both of them. So the way I look at, again, Western classical music and Indian classical music is through the lens of how they both are trying to answer questions of melody and harmony in both cases, through the idea of manipulating the notes to prolong the sense of non-resolution until the very, very last minute when they really have to. And the beauty and the tricks and the wonder of all this kind of music happens in that journey of how they take you from home to away to back home. And that's kind of universal.
Thanks for helping me and the audience to understand the slight but very interesting difference between both classical music and how it works when it comes to the harmony and other aspect of the music. My next question is it necessary for an Indian classical musician to study Western classical music and Western classical musician to study Indian classical music?
No, of course not. I mean, if you're an Indian classical musician, you don't necessarily need to have Western classical knowledge in order for you to succeed, and the same goes the other way around. You don't necessarily need Indian classical music to succeed as a Western classical musician. However, I think the age that we kind of live in demands us to kind of look in deeper and say, what are the things that both these genres have really explored and worked on for hundreds and thousands of years to kind of provide answers to? And are there ways for us to kind of implement that in the other one, or maybe not implement, but just look at it through the lens of those to provide maybe not just answers, but just a different perspective on what we're performing or what we're listening to give you maybe a whole new idea for something else to be born out of. Because a lot of the time what happens is people get into these little groups and say, okay, mine's very complicated music or whatever, and they start to forget about what the beauty of music is, and to understand those differences, but at the same time understanding the similarities, provides you this unique avenue to kind of walk down for you to take and pick and choose things that you might think might fit well in the other one. So, like, Indian classical music has wonderful improvisational skills that can be used in Western classical music. And while Western classical music has its own improvisational angle to it, there are things that I'm sure that can be learned from Indian classical music in terms of their use of the idea of a drone, or their use of rhythm and how beautiful it's kind of intricately woven in, and how that's used to manipulate your idea of time, which is, again, a wonderful concept. And similarly, in Western classical music, there's the idea of creating a map through which people can navigate and create these complex structures of multiple people kind of performing together. Because Western classical music, at the end of it, is still, for a large part, an art form which involves a large amount of people on average. I mean, unless you're singing art songs again, or for the most part, orchestras and choirs, they all are very, very big group activities. And Indian classical music, on the other hand, usually is just either two musicians or maybe even just one musician, and sometimes it's an ensemble, but mostly they're all trying to perform their own particular thing. And that's beautiful. It's kind of like looking at it from both angles, saying, okay, maybe we can look at the idea of the individual from Indian classical music and the idea of the collective from Western classical music, and understand these both perspectives and say, maybe there's a way that we kind of put these two together and say, okay, what would happen if we kind of did this particular harmonization of a particular, and we made like a whole choir understanding of a Tyagaraja Kirtana, or we said, okay, what can we do in Western classical music, and say, okay, there are things like ornamentations and runs, but how do we understand what gamakam is, or what murki is, or what taan is, and how does that work in Western classical music? I mean, it's just the idea of exploration, looking at these concepts from a very pure and open stance, to kind of say that maybe there are avenues through which beauty can happen.
Thank you so much for the answer. And as you've studied in Chennai, you mentioned, how is it to study abroad, and how is the education system different from India?
Well, yeah, I mean, education systems are a very interesting topic, something that I'm really, really interested in. I think you have to look at it through a couple of different angles. So in India, of course, the idea of music education in a very systematic form doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists on maybe a theoretical level where in schools and in colleges there might be certain degree courses that you can take, but these are all relatively new, and they again are kind of finding their feet through these kinds of programs, and which is wonderful. I mean, I know that they're going to only improve over the years and have their own understanding of how to effectively educate people to kind of get into the music profession. However, what happens when you're kind of starting out in any field and you're trying to create some robust infrastructure is there lacks, at the moment at least in India, as far as I know, there's only a few institutions which are doing wonderful work, and a large part due to there being an understanding from the outside of what models work and what don't work. Because in India, for the largest point of time, the idea of music education was happening from a very one-to-one perspective. Like, you know a teacher who is amazing because you know somebody who studied with them and you go to them for lessons, which is again a beautiful tradition which is carried on. But what happens is the knowledge gets very isolated within to these, again, groups, which preserve the knowledge very effectively, but then it doesn't provide a very large amateur audience to then have some sort of engagement with the art form. So you do need some sort of either community music happening, or you need some sort of a larger structure to say here's a place of knowledge that you can attend in order for you to kind of access this knowledge and then gain skills and then perhaps go further with it in your profession. That is of course necessary because you will get virtuosos when you have one-to-one teachings and things like that, but what you won't have is a mass engagement of people if there's no structured avenue. That's kind of what happens when you have, like, for better or for worse, engineering colleges and sciences kind of took off because there is a path forward for people can see that there is an avenue for them to kind of get a job and also kind of look into that as a prospect. However, that's not the case in most arts education, but music especially in India. So that's one of the biggest differences in when you see educational systems in the West. And I'm not saying that that somehow there's the Indians' education is not inferior or whatever. I'm just saying that the West has currently an understanding of how to engage a mass amount of people in their systems. Now, you can argue many points saying the effectiveness of these systems and how to kind of change them and tweak them. But I guess they have a bedrock of something to kind of fall back on. So my whole thing would be, if India is going to go down a path of creating, robust infrastructure for them to kind of allow for this to happen, they need to take into account all of these things of what has worked in the West, what hasn't worked in the West, what has worked in countries and other Southeast Asian countries like China and Singapore and Japan, and looking at the structures of, okay, what is something that is natively Indian that can work within our social sensibilities and our understanding of education and provide a wholesome education to students for them to kind of meaningfully pursue a career in music. And so, yeah, that's kind of my understanding of where India and is in terms of music education. I mean, again, I'm just going to reiterate that there are some really wonderful institutes in India which are doing this incredible work. So yeah, I mean, encouraging them and also kind of working with them to find new avenues is one solution.
Thank you so much. So whoever is watching this video and whoever is planning to open their own music studio and institution or a place to study music, then you should already be thinking about these points. My very last question of today is what advice would you like to give to someone who is willing to study abroad in prestigious colleges like Trinity Laban?
So if you want to study in a conservatoire, you kind of have to ask yourself a couple of questions. What is it that you want to achieve through the conservatoire? So a lot of conservatoires most of the time are focused on either the classical world, the jazz world. And so conservatoires are set up in a way where they have a lot of amazing pedagogues who will teach you the traditions of whatever instrument or voice you're about to pursue. And they will take you down that journey of perfecting your craft as much as you want to. And that's a noble pursuit, but it's something you have to ask yourself of whether that's something that you want to do, whether you want to become an opera singer, a concert pianist, an oboist. These are the kind of questions that you have to kind of think before you get into a conservatoire, because you will be going through a lot of theory, a lot of composition, a lot of working within chamber groups of small amounts of people. You will be doing a lot of that kinds of activity, which is all geared towards working through a certain structure that conservatoires kind of find themselves in. Now, there are a lot of innovations happening in conservatoire as well, where they kind of force you to collaborate and think out of the box. But that's kind of what a conservatoire life would be. Otherwise, you can also look into universities. Universities are a little bit more academic oriented. Conservatoires have academic sections as well. However, they're not the focus of the institute. Universities, on the other hand, usually don't have strong performance departments, although they do in some circumstances. And universities, again, will give you more of a holistic understanding of the subject from a non-technical perspective, if that makes any sense. So if you can kind of think of it from that perspective, saying that if I want to go to a conservatoire, it's a lot of rigor in terms of the way that you hone your craft as an instrumentalist or vocalist, and if that's something that you want to go down. And so that would be my advice of looking at it from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, for your valuable time in this pandemic situation. I hope you're doing absolutely well. I wish you all the very best for your upcoming projects.
All right. Thanks, Vivek. It was great to talk to you. Hopefully we'll be able to catch up really soon. All right. Bye-bye.
My dear viewers, if you're still here, I thank you a lot for watching the video. I hope you would have learned something from this, and if it was useful in any way possible, kindly do let me know by commenting down in the comment section. And if you want more information from the musicians around the globe, do let me know. Thanks for watching. See you in the next podcast. Bye-bye.